There's a quick warning that we're going to go ahead and start recording. Excellent. So welcome. Our topic is Microsoft Sentinel. Take control of your security in the cloud. For additional background on Sentinel, make sure you check out the resources at the end of the presentation and, of course, Adam's blog this month. Whether you're just getting started with Sentinel or you've been using it for a while, I'm sure you get a lot out of this session today. So with me today is Adam Oakes. Adam prides himself in being a trusted advisor with our customers and is a tech nerd at childhood. Most of his free time is spent around technology and computers. Despite being studying neuropsychology in school, his love for technology lead him back into the IT world, which he has worked professionally for the last 15 years. Starting with Exchange and email support, his background expanded into Microsoft 365 and Azure as the cloud grew more in prominence. In recent years, he's pushed his specialization around compliance, cybersecurity, and other areas in the Microsoft cloud. Adam heads up our managed services team, so hopefully some of you have worked with him. And he loves to work on new challenges and problems and has a passion to enable others to achieve their visions. Adam lives in San Antonio, Texas, where he spends his time smoking barbecue, drinking whiskey, and enjoying cigars. My kind of guy. Welcome, Adam, and we're so glad you're joining us today on the program. I think you and Jimmy Briggs are vying for most appearances, so welcome back, and I'd love to have you both back for the Ignite recap in November that we're coming up here on.
Yeah, we'll be good. I'll go ahead and give a shout out to people too. For everyone out there, they have online registration for Ignite. Even if you guys can't actually go to the sessions when they're live, you can actually view VODs of the sections later. So I encourage everyone to go out there and check out Microsoft's Ignite registration. Wonderful resource to be able to go in and get information. So I'll give a shout out to that as well.
But if you don't have time, check us back in November and December when we'll go over.
Even if you have time, you should check us back in November.
That's true. That's true. So before we get started with this discussion, let's quickly go over the agenda. We're going to first obviously talk about do an overview of Sentinel, what it's all about, how to get started. Adam's going to go over a couple of different demos. We're going to end with talking about this legacy authentication update, which I'm sure a lot of folks are a little concerned about. Hopefully they've got their work done, but if not, we can certainly answer your questions as best as we know. And then we'll end with some useful resources. And obviously we got a couple questions in before the show started, so we'll definitely hit on those before we wrap up. So let's do some quick housekeeping, do a quick poll. Casey, if you could launch the poll. Are you currently using Sentinel? We're just kind of curious where you are in your journey, if you've used it before. If you are coming into this blind and this is your first time, and that's okay, because Adam's going to lay it all out for you. But we just kind of curious, if where you're at in your journey. So we'll not wait for that poll right now, but we'll keep moving on. And we're going to go ahead and get started. So Adam, can you set the stage for today's conversation about SIEM? I know some people call it SIEM, SOAR, what it all stands for. It's a lot of acronyms. What's this all about, Adam?
Sure, yeah, and so everyone's kind of on the same page here. I know multiple of you guys have hopefully been in sessions I've done before. I'm a very hands-on person. I very much like to get my fingers dirty with the tools. So a lot of the presentation today is going to be focused on demo. Hopefully everyone's cool with that. But I wanted to do some baseline. We're going to go through these first slides a little quickly, but you'll hear the word SIEM and SOAR put out there a lot. The acronyms I actually put on the slides, so you guys can go through and see them and review them later. SIEM stands for Security Information and Event Management, and SOAR stands for Security Orchestration and Automated Response. In plain English, these are the tools that you'll use to aggregate all of the security logs from the various tools that you have. And then the SOAR side is really where you can start to automate some of your responses to that. When you're really looking at where the future of security is going, it's about scaling. It's about going through the large amounts of data, because as we grow bigger in the cloud, more and more data is being generated. And it's about figuring out ways that you can be force multipliers for your staff. Kind of gone are the days, or at least going away are the days, of where companies are expected to have a security operations center that has 30 people staffed 24/7. Instead, you're seeing more tools like Sentinel come out that are really using machine learning and artificial intelligence to kind of add that scalability. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today.
Thanks, Adam. And it looks like we got some results from our poll already, and I'm really glad to see that we've got some first-timers here that they have not used Sentinel. So hopefully by the end of this, we can turn around some people and let them know about what they can do with Sentinel for free even. So we'll get to that, though. All right. Go ahead, Adam.
Oh, no, you're perfectly fine. So, like I said, we'll probably go through these slides a little quickly. If you're interested in getting the PowerPoint presentation to review later, by all means you can. But I want to hit on some of the major points about Sentinel before we get into the demo. So one of the really nice things is there's a very low entry level point for you guys. There's no infrastructure that's actually going to be required and no ongoing maintenance. Ultimately, these are tools that you can leverage inside of the Azure portal. We're going to go in and use various connectors to basically pull information from the data sources you're wanting to do. It will scale for you automatically. There's no actual limits to the amount that you have. There are costs, and we'll discuss that because I know there's always questions on what are the costs associated with this. But at its core, you're not having to add baseline infrastructure for Sentinel. It's basically a tool that's going to run in the cloud for you.
Yeah. So no infrastructure costs. This all used to have to be done on-prem, and then scalability became a problem, right? Because, as the logs and more storage, and, it's really hard to keep up with that kind of thing as the logs became bigger and bigger and bigger.
Well, and just sizing of your workforce.
Yeah.
I've worked at a traditional provider, in my past, and our SOC team was 80 people deep that had to be staffed 24/7, had to have people with different roles. And like I said, that's kind of going to the wayside a little bit. The other thing here, and what I'm going to kind of be focusing on my presentation, is there's a lot of stuff that you can do for free in Sentinel where you actually won't even have a cost. I've had Sentinel set up in my lab for about 5 years now, 4 years really since Sentinel came out. And all of my Office 365 and Azure AD data are pulled in, and I pay no cost whatsoever for that. But I still get the benefits of having that single pane of glass and some of the stuff we'll talk about today. So part of what we'll be going through and looking at is, well, what can you do today for free? This is You Already Own It after all. But then we'll also address the side of, well, where do costs eventually come in? What do I need to expect?
Absolutely. And hopefully that will change some people's minds about the free. Everyone likes free. Go ahead.
Yeah, as we're going through and looking at this, where we're going to basically start out, and again, we'll get all of this into the demo, but the core operating model of what we're going through and doing is going to be based off of connectors. These are basically tools that Microsoft has set up to ingest information for various stuff. So you can go in there and set up a connector to pull in information on your VMs from Azure. You can set it up to pull in Office 365 or Azure AD, but you'll also see they have a whole bunch of third-party connectors as well, too. This includes stuff like AWS, Google Public Cloud, some of the stuff you may not necessarily think of. And really, it's smart from Microsoft's standpoint. They basically want to give you a tool that can sit across your various services and really give you that aggregation point so that you have that one-stop shop. And I thought this is super impressive when you go through and look at it. This is data from last year, but Microsoft says that they do over 20 petabytes of daily ingestion. That is very important when you go through and look at it. A petabyte is obviously a huge amount of data, but one of the things that Sentinel does, say there's a new attack vector that happens in the United Arab Emirates where someone's doing some sort of PowerShell exploit. Well, as Microsoft realizes that and adapts to it, looks at the signals that caused it, they're automatically going in and updating their framework inside of Sentinel and across Defender to make the other users aware of what can happen. So suddenly, even though this attack has happened on the other side of the world, you're going to be protected from that as soon as Microsoft is going in and updating their database. And that really brings in the power of machine learning and artificial intelligence, that even though something may be happening on the other side of the world, normally same day, you're going to be protected from that same type of attack, which is really, really cool. And one of the things that really adds value when you're looking at a scalable cloud solution like Sentinel.
Absolutely. And from my last update I got, it's up to 60 trillion with a T, trillion signals a day Microsoft is analyzing, which is
nuts. And I'm sure we'll get even bigger numbers when we go through and see the Sentinel sessions on Ignite here next month.
Yeah, absolutely. It keeps multiplying the numbers each time we hear it. Yeah.
And then again, when we're going through and talking about it, you can ultimately go in and use machine learning and also some stuff in the community. I'm going to make sure I get to it, but there's some really great resources that we're going to look at the end of where Microsoft has this giant GitHub repository of stuff that customers have made that they use, that they leverage, that they've then put out there for other people to go in and consume. And it's great.
Yeah, absolutely there. All right. So AI by your side, what's this all about?
So this kind of goes into the idea of what artificial intelligence and what the automation can really do. So part of what I'm going to do, and if you read my blog beforehand, you'd see this. When I view Sentinel, when I'm thinking about kind of how to operationalize it, I really see Sentinel as a tiered model. In my head, it's almost a Russian nesting doll of each layer gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But where you really start to get to the true value and scale at the end is going to be when we really start to leverage some of that artificial intelligence and some of that automation you can do, and what they traditionally refer to as playbooks, but where you're coming in and leveraging stuff like Azure Logic Apps. We'll get into some of that and talk about it and talk about some examples we've seen with customers. But part of what's really going to be powerful here, and part of what the Microsoft product team talks about a lot, is one of the things that they really do is Sentinel should really only be triggering when you actually have events that you need to go in and investigate. It gets a little redundant if you have all these security systems out there that are checking logs, but it's firing nonstop. You get to the point that when an alert fires, it's okay, well, let's go see what happened. And it's normally not something that's concerning. One of the things that I really like about Sentinel is because it uses that machine learning and artificial intelligence, it's really honing in on the signals that actually matter and the ones that you actually want to go through and check.
All right. And then this next slide, we're going to talk about built-in orchestration. What does this mean with playbooks? And playbooks are very different than workbooks. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the differences there.
Yeah, I'll probably get into that when we get into the actual demo section. But this gets into the last tier, the tier 4 of value that I really see, and that gets into the idea of automation. If you guys have ever messed with Azure Logic Apps, they're basically like tenant-wide flows or Power Automates if you've ever done that. But it's ways that you can go in that are based off of a trigger that can build in automation. And that's really where you get into the power of where you can scale some of the stuff that you can do in Sentinel. It's not just aggregating logs, not just giving you a surface to go through and look at, but to start to go through and automate certain responses to it, which can really, really help.
So this is the source side of the SIEM, right?
This is the orchestration side.
The orchestration side. So things like, when alerts fire, it opens up a ServiceNow ticket, for instance, right?
Yeah, I have some of those even deployed in my lab where you can go through and say, open up a ticket or shoot an email out to someone when they need it. But you can even do more than that. You can even start to automate certain responses where if you know the type of alert that's being triggered, and I'll even talk about some examples with that.
Awesome. So how does it work?
So this is the high level slide for people to kind of go through and review later. I'm not going to go through all the individual responses, but at its core, you're pulling in all of your data. That's where we're starting over here on the left hand side. You're pulling in all your data and collecting it through various collectors, and then we're getting into what actually is happening inside of what you're doing in Sentinel. So they have a dashboard.
These are the connectors?
Primarily these are the connectors, and I'll go through and show how some of those are set up. Then you get to the idea of just having visibility in what you're doing. But when you start to go up, again, this is basically going through the tiers that we define in the blog. The first level is just basic logs and visibility and getting in. From there, you start to use machine learning to analyze those logs and get some value out of it. Once you do that, you can then start to tie all the various logs and services together to give you a more complete picture of what's happening from the security system on your side. So it's the idea of, I had an anomalous login that happened from a country that I hadn't seen before. I know what machine that connected to, and then I can suddenly see some PowerShell scripts were run on that machine, right after the fact. So I can immediately go through and start responding to, hey, someone logged in that maybe shouldn't have been in the system. Now let's trace what that person did when they were in the system. And that's kind of the power that Sentinel can start to give to you. And then the final layer where you go in there goes to the idea of playbooks and automation and Azure Logic Apps. We're getting to automate and orchestrated response. Ultimately, Sentinel is built on Azure Monitor and Azure Log Analytics. We'll talk about that a little bit too. But that's the core of what you're doing. And the final part when you're going through is some of the integrations that you can go through and pull in other stuff. So again, ticketing systems that you can pull into, other different communities, stuff like Salesforce that you can pull data into. You can even pull in on-premises servers, things like that.
Anything through syslog, right?
Syslog and seps logs are the two most common ones that you see if you're not sure what the connections are going to bring in, but you can pull in all that data.
So got the connectors, and then we got dashboards. Is dashboards and workbooks synonymous?
Yes and no. I mean, dashboard in general is going to be where you go through and land when you come into Sentinel. That can also be looking through the actual logs themselves. Workbooks are a little bit different. That's visualizations. But again, we'll show that in the demo. Okay,
very cool. And then obviously we end with playbooks and automation. Okay, cool. Got it. All right. So you ready to do this demo? Start the demo?
Yeah, let's go ahead and go. I'll share my screen and we can kind of get into it. Like I said, if you guys haven't been with me before when I'm going through and doing one of these, I'm very much a hands-on person. I hated it when I first started getting involved in the technical community, and I would go to presentations that were all PowerPoint. It was just like, well, sure, it works perfectly when you've taken screenshots. So first and foremost, getting into it, if you haven't done anything in Azure before, you're going to have the requirement of having to have an Azure workspace. So you have to go in and deploy that out. There's different models you can do. If you're one of our customers on the Gov side, you might have an AOSG account with us. If you're on the commercial, you might have a CSP account with us. You might have an EA with Microsoft. You could even have a pay-as-you-go model. This is my lab environment, so I'm just a pay-as-you-go model. I have a credit card on file. But even though I've gone through and built that out, Microsoft technically has my credit card on file, I can tell you guys I've never incurred any cost for Sentinel. That was kind of my approach to setting it up. I wanted to do it free. That also means there's only certain stuff that I'm ingesting, but hopefully we'll still see everything. But wanted to start on this page to tell you, if you haven't done it before, step one is going to be creating a workspace, and then you can actually go in and launch Sentinel. If you're looking for where to find it, you can actually just search for Sentinel. It's one of the separate tabs you can do. You can actually just come up here and search, and it'll be a button you can go through and click on. This is the landing page. This is the dashboard that we're going through and talking about, Ken, when we were looking at the last slide. But from a high level, this is what the landing page looks like when we're coming into Sentinel. Now, again, we're only going to have about 25, 30 minutes for the demo, so I'm going to go moderately quickly through. If you guys want to go deeper down into this, you can either talk to me or some of my colleagues. But what I really wanted to show you guys is how we're going to go through and have the basic setup, the type of things you need to consider. And then we're going to start to look at where some of the real value comes in. So starting first and foremost, I want to talk about connectors. If you've used Flow or Power Automate before, you used some of the cooler stuff you can do in Teams, you're very comfortable with the idea of connectors. You can see as of today, there are 124 pre-built connectors that you can go through and select. And as I was kind of mentioning, you'll see stuff like AWS is listed here. You can pull in Apache. If we go a little bit further down, they're going to have F5s in here. They have Cisco and Citrix systems in here. You have the ability to go in and look at a whole bunch of Microsoft services, but it's not going to be limited to just Microsoft. There's going to be tons of different services that people can go through and consider wanting to pull in. Typically, these are created in conjunction of the actual Sentinel engineers and architects and product team, as well as people with whatever service they're going through and doing. So you can see, for instance, I have Office 365 set up. There's one of the ones I went through and connected. When I first went in here, literally all it does is make you sign in with the global admin of your Office 365 account. And by going through and doing that, I can connect. Similarly, if we go back here up to the top, you're going to see I'm going to have Azure AD connected and pulled in as well too. Same thing. It's just going to make me go in and sign up and pull in. I want to actually open up a connector page and talk about this a little bit of a step further. When you're going through and looking at what all the connectors are, this is the baseline of how you're going to be ingesting and pulling in data. It will then give you some records about like how much information you're pulling in and what you're doing. But the cool thing that I wanted to look at was some of this stuff right here. So if you notice when I'm going to the connector page for Azure AD, for instance, there are 2 queries that comes with it and 8 workbooks. I'm going to start here with queries. This is a very straightforward process. Anyone who's ever worked with logging before is going to understand what this is going through and doing. But queries are basic commands that you can do against an aggregate of logs. So they have queries that you can go in and run. It's really easy. I can actually click the run button from here and it'll actually pull up the queries in my log section, ingest in what I said to run, and go through and run it. This then allows me to go in and dig in. You can see this is basically just going in and saying, go ahead and take the 1,000 most recent logins for my Azure AD sign-in logs. Now, if I was a nerd and knew what I was doing, I could come in here and modify the queries to have it pull what I want. But think of this as the first tier of ingestion into what we're going through and doing with Sentinel. This is going to give you an aggregate where you can pull in all your information and you can go in and actively query and actively dig into what that data is saying. For the longest time, this is how most SOCs work. They had people that would go in that would have certain queries to run. They'd know certain information to look for, and they're ultimately going through and just reading and interpreting the logs that were coming in. And this is still viable and still something you can consider today. You can dig in the logs as you're going through and looking in here. And I would say, to me, this is a little bit more readable and understandable about what we're going through and looking at versus if I was just looking at like the Azure AD sign-in logs on their own. So you can go in here and you can look at what the queries are. You can modify it. And again, each connector is going to have its own built-in queries for you to go through and consider as you're looking at what all is involved there. I'm going to go out of here. And so I wanted to show you guys too, just to give you a juxtaposition to this. We'll pull up the Office 365 one, which I think I just passed. Oh, I haven't yet. We'll pull up the Office 365 one, and again, you can see there's other queries I can come in here and run. And so maybe I want to go through and see SharePoint and OneDrive logs. So I can go through here and click run. It's going to go through and run and then pull out the information for me. So again, everyone probably understands this baseline level of what we're going through and doing. The next tier is honestly where 95% of the customers that we work with really get to. And I think that that's perfectly okay. And I think the value the next tier really brings in is reason enough to go through and consider deploying Sentinel today from your side. And what I'm going to be talking about is the idea of workbooks. So workbooks is what Ken was kind of talking about at the beginning here. And workbooks, again, to me, is probably like the tier 2 value of what we're going through and looking at. But it's actually really, really powerful what it goes through and allows you to do. So once this loads up on my side, my connection's being a little slow for us. I think of workbooks in my head as we're going through and looking at this. And let me try this again here. So we'll come in and I will view the template, see if it works this way. So when I think of workbooks when I'm going through and doing it, I think of Power BI almost in my head. If you've gone through and used Power BI or other data representation tools, you're going to be familiar with the type of stuff that a workbook is going to do. So what this is primarily going to give me is visualizations of the data that we talked about in tier 1. So tier 1 is queries and logs. Workbooks, when we're going to the tier 2, is going through and putting visualizations and informations that allow you to more easily consume that data. And so you can see I have different things I can set up here. Worth noting, when we've talked about the idea of I'm pulling in data from Office 365 and Azure AD, and I can ultimately go through and do it for free. Azure AD logs by default off storage for a minimum of 30 days. They can potentially be up to 90 days in your system. Because I am already paying for that storage as part of my licensing model with Office 365, if I just go in and set up the connector for Azure AD or for Office 365, by default, that data is going to be stored and ingested in Log Analytics for free, and I'm going to have no cost there. Now, if you're trying to meet certain compliance regulations, so say I'm trying to meet CMMC or I'm trying to meet HIPAA or I'm trying to meet CGIS, whatever it is, and you decide to store your logs for a longer period of time, which most people do if they do Sentinel, that's where you're going to start to see some costs for it. But the baseline ingestion of where you're just going in and not modifying the length of storage, you're just ingesting in what the default is with the services you're already consuming, is going to have no cost to it. So as you go through and look here, I can actually hold and navigate over. And if you notice the numbers at the bottom of my screen down here are actually changing based off of, it's giving me users of who is the user that connected, how many connections came in. This is actually looking at sign-in logs. Similarly, I can scroll a little bit down and I can see a very easy visualization over the last 30 days of countries that my users have connected from. Now, I did this purposely because I knew I was going to be doing this demo, but you can see suddenly, oh, hey, that's a connections coming in. I'm not even sure what G is. Greece, I believe, off the top of my head. So this is a connection coming in from Greece. I'm a US-based defense contractor. I probably don't have anyone connecting from Greece that I should be aware of. Here we go. There's someone connecting from Indonesia, from Thailand, from Malaysia, a whole bunch of different connections in here. That's probably something for me to be aware of. Now, if I was trying to go through and look at this data just in the Azure AD sign-in logs, it would be there, but it would just be buried in a list of logs that I'm going through and looking at that are probably going to be time generated based off of when they came in. If I know what I'm doing, I could dig and I could find the information, but how much easier is it for me to come in and look at this workbook? And one of the first graphs, I can immediately see, hey, there's some sign-ins coming from countries that I'm not really sure should be signing into my system. And by going through and looking at it, if I click on one of these sign-ins when we're going through and doing, I can actually see which user was going through and signing in. I can get an understanding of, okay, this was this user that was signing in. This was this type of system. Similarly, when we go down here, you can even see sign-ins by device. So I can see, okay, it looks like I've had an iOS phone and it looks like I've had Windows 10 devices connecting to my system. So again, maybe I come in here and I suddenly see a device that I'm not used to seeing. I had one customer that everyone inside of their organization was given iPhones, and suddenly they saw Android operating systems connected into their system. It was a breach. But just by them going through and having this workbook deployed and just being able to see suddenly in the sign-ins device list, hey, that probably shouldn't be there, was enough to kind of indicate to them, hey, something's off, something's not right here. I want to show one more thing real quick before I go on from workbooks. I want to show the idea of going through and looking at another workbook for 365. The Azure AD sign-in logs is one of my favorite ones. But again, just want to give you guys an idea of what the visualizations of these different workbooks look like. Every single connector that you go in and set up typically comes with at least one workbook that you can go in and consider. But all of the data that you can get out of it is actually super, super interesting as you go through and look at it. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to view this template as well too. This is going to make me set. Again, if you notice, by default, it's set to 90 days. That goes to the idea that this information about your login in Office 365 is stored for 90 days. So again, I'm not paying anything to do this. I'm just going through and having the data. But again, this is going to give me visualizations that I can go in and dig into. Now, maybe this is a little hard to see at the 90-day window, but I could drop this down. Let's say I'm going to be good and I'm actually checking my logs more commonly. So I'm going to drop this down to 7 days. It instantly becomes a little bit more readable as I can go through and see the different workloads that are being done. I can see the activity by workloads of SharePoint, Exchange, OneDrive, Teams, what my users are going through and doing. And I can even see the commands that they're going through and doing on their side. Again, wonderful, wonderful way for me to go in and dig into what's happening inside of my environment and get an understanding of what's going on. The partners that I've worked with pretty heavily that really take value out of Sentinel and what they're doing, they start to understand where is the valuable information of the stuff that they should be looking at. Typically, they have like, okay, once a week, we have one person who's going to go in and review what's happening in our logs. Is going to look through certain workbooks, look for certain things, and then go through and document that you're doing that. I'm not going to lie, most of the time, this is driven by a need to meet a certain compliance level for some sort of contract or some sort of system they're needing to do. But it genuinely increases the overall security fingerprint of what you're doing. And keep in mind, everything you guys are seeing in my environment right here, every single person on this call that has Office 365 could go in and deploy today for no cost whatsoever. So absolutely great. Again, we're only at tier 2. I'm going to pivot a little bit and I want to talk about tier 3. And tier 3 gets to the idea where we're going a level up after what I think of as the workbooks and what you're doing. It gets into the idea of hunting. Now, it's worth noting, I'm not going to be able to show you guys hunting too much in my lab. So we're going to temporarily go back to this presentation where I've gone in and pulled some stuff, but I wanted you to see this tab. If you notice, there's a whole bunch of different stuff it automatically has me that I can go in and do, where they have queries built in that is looking for asynchronous activity for me to go through and run. And if you notice, you can actually build up a list of queries and choose to run them all at once. But Ken, you want to take over presenting the presentation real quick again, and we'll go through and talk about hunting?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to.
Sure. So what you're seeing here, this is classic content. If you notice, this is admin@contoso.com, which everyone has seen Contoso stuff before. That's Microsoft's default fake company. But what you're seeing here is a visualization map that's being put together based off of alerts that happen. As we look over these next couple of slides, you're going to see them digging through what an actual hunting can be. But if you remember when I set this up and started talking, the idea behind hunting is now that you're pulling in logs and information from multiple different systems, when you notice something that may be off in system 1, you can correlate that through your environment, what's going on. What we're going to be looking through here in this specific example that we're showing in the screenshots, if you notice, there's going to be originally some failed logins that were happening from an unknown location. This is over on the far left, Ken. If you notice the failed logins over there for the user of Darcy Robles, but eventually that login works. And when that login works, what happens? And you can notice looking at this map right now, well, what happens is they connect to a couple systems and they run some suspicious PowerShell commands, but ultimately the login that's going to be tied to Darcy, which in our case is going to be like a negative login, it's going to be a security breach. You can not only see the systems and the users and the computers that connected to, you can even go in and see what actual commands and what actual executable things were done there. So you want to go to the next slide, Ken?
Absolutely. You got me excited now. I want to do alerts.
Yeah, so this gets into the idea of actually digging into the incident. So what we've done is this is would have been if you clicked on the far left link on that last page we had, and this is going in and isolating, hey, there was this anonymous login, something you might want to be aware of. Here's the timestamp to it. Here's the user. Here's the machine they logged into. Go ahead and go to the next page again, Ken. And this is actually looking in and digging into what happens. You can see the actual details of the SID, the login ID of what they're going through and doing. This is just pulling up the info on what actually happened for the login to try to get an understanding of what's going on. Again, these are all stuff you could pull in through the hunting tab of Sentinel to try to kind of dig into what's going on. Think about how much easier this is to navigate into someone trying to just pour through logs manual on their own. Go ahead and go to the next slide again, Ken.
So just to make sure
Go
you're
ahead.
clear, this is still this threat hunting part is still free as far as you're
still
using
free
it.
completely
You're
once you have
still
the
using
systems
the
in
same
place. Yep.
workbooks. Yeah, got it.
You're still using the same data that you're ingesting in.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
this is then going in and trying to get an understanding of what's going on. So as you hover over each entity, it will reveal a list of queries that you can go through and do. So again, we talked about queries. I kind of put that as the tier 1. What this is doing is as you're going in and looking at hunting, it's giving you stuff that you can run that pulls through log queries that may be helpful. So if you notice here, we've gone in and we know that this bad user has logged into this computer. It will, one, not only tell me relevant alerts that may be going on from there, it gives me these queries that I can go in and say, well, tell me the processes that are currently running on the host. Tell me the services that were created on the host. Tell me if any user accounts were created. These are all queries that are obviously a good thing to do when you're trying to investigate a security alert. And Sentinel is going to say, hey, we know people that are using the product. These are the type of things they want to know when they're following an anomalous login activity. So we can suggest these to you to do it. This is the power of artificial intelligence and machine learning. This is Microsoft knowing what works for other people and how to dig into events, and then basically serving you those options on a platter so you don't have to reinvent the wheel yourself.
Excellent, excellent.
And then this is, again, kind of tying it all together. If you go and choose an exploration query, that will show up as an additional alert. So they've gone in and said, okay, we want to figure out what's going on. We want to figure out what they've done. That will go in and pull the information so you go through and see it. Add it to the visualization graph. It'll go in and add that information to the graph so you can go through and see it on your side and know what's going on.
At 2 o'clock our
Hold on a second,
time.
I think we got to meet somebody.
Provide-
Yep.
Yep,
No
we're
worries.
good. All right, you ready for the next slide?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, there we go.
So this is the final one, I think, on hunting where we go through. This is tying the whole picture together of what all was happening, what it looks like, tying the event into alerts that all were triggered together and going through. Again, not going to spend too much time on this, but I wanted to show you the visual representation of what this looks like. Because I don't have a ton of different services pulled into my lab, not so great for me to demo that there. I basically have one user, but this gives you the idea of how you'll actually try to tie in and dig into events when they get created, which will ultimately lead to our fourth tier of value, which is automation, which I think is our next slide, if I timed this right, Ken. Wait, no, one more after that. Hopefully one more after that. This just shows isolating it down. So yeah, so I'm going to talk about community resources and automation. Go ahead and go to the next slide too, because I'll show that and then we'll talk about it. This gets into the idea of Azure Logic Apps, which is really our automation, which is our tier 4. So I'm going to take over sharing again. I want to talk about, now that we've talked about hunting, where we go the next level, which is automation. This is kind of a, go ahead, Ken.
It looks just like Power Automate, really. The same kind of idea with the.
It does. Like I said, you can think of Azure Logic Apps as basically tenant-wide Power Automates. Rather than being tied to a specific user, it's stuff you're going through. And you can do more stuff with it. If you've ever wondered, hey, what's the best way for me to automate a PowerShell script to run? Azure Logic Apps is the answer to that. But what they can go through and do is basically have built-in triggers that then go through and flow. Now, the name of this has changed. If you notice when we first got in here, Ken was asking, part of that we were laughing earlier when him and I were talking about prepping for this. He was like, well, are workbooks and playbooks the same? And I'm like, no, they're entirely different. And it's like, well, they sound the same. What's the difference? Playbooks is where you get into the automation side, but now if you notice, there's nothing that says playbooks here. It's now actually under the automation tab. So when you come in here, you can see I actually have active playbooks. These are playbooks that I've deployed out my Sentinel and tested out before at various times. You'll notice I have stuff like post a message to Slack or post a message to Teams. I can even go in and do something like automate, reset the Azure Active Directory password for people, open a Zendesk ticket, do things like that. Whole bunch of different options of what you can go through and do. If we actually dig into some of these to see the idea of the type of things that it will be going through and doing, you'll notice when I come in here and edit it in the same way of the workbook that Kim was looking, this looks exactly like a Power Automate if you've ever done those before. It goes in, is going to have a connection into the system. It's then going to go in and get information and then figure out the steps of what it needs to do to go through and actually automate a response. So this is what, go ahead, Ken.
So are we still free? We're getting into automation.
So in theory, yes, you are still free.
Okay.
So when you're going through and looking at Azure Logic Apps, there can be some cost of what you're going through and doing to actually run the automation. This is going to get a little bit more complicated. And this question of pricing, in fact, I should probably just take a moment to do an aside. I know basically both the questions we got before we started this were related to cost. This is an interesting thing when we're talking about Sentinel. We're free when we're going through to talk about connection sources that already you are ingesting or you're already paying for and licensing in another way. But when we go through and talk about the added additional services and tangential services that are related to Sentinel, that's where the waters get a little bit more murky. So first and foremost, when we're talking about storage in Sentinel long-term, there are two costs. There is a cost for ingestion of the logs, and there's a cost for long-term storage. You can actually pull up an Azure cost calculator, and it'll go through and ask you questions. How much are you ingesting a day? What all you need need to be aware of. But realistically, it's okay, you're going to pay to pull that data in to Azure Log Analytics, and you're going to pay to store that data long term. Then if you're wanting to go through and run queries and run information against it, there could potentially be charges for that too. I can tell you guys from doing this a whole bunch with different customers, normally the ingestion cost is larger than the storage cost. One of my customers who uses Sentinel pretty heavily, that has their whole app deployment inside of Azure, they ingest something like 100 gigs a day, and I think they end up paying about $1,000 for their ingestion cost and about $200 for their storage cost. Now, the storage cost is slightly going up. They have to be a CGIS qualified shop, and so their storage cost, they went through and set their logs to save for 2 years. They haven't hit the 2-year mark, so every month that data is going up by a month more of data. So slowly that storage cost is creeping up, but the storage cost is still about a fourth of what it is from the actual ingestion cost. And the ingestion cost is when you pass that window of what is free from what you're paying for the Office 365 services, but you say, no, I want to store this for longer, you pay that ingestion at the end of that free period to actually ingest that data into Azure Log Analytics. The second piece of that, which is why this gets murky, as we're going through and talking about automation, you start to talk about, well, one, there is typically a cost of when you're going through and looking at Azure Logic Apps for them to run, based on how long it takes them to run and stuff like that. But you also potentially have to think about cost of aggregate services that you're doing as well too. If you look at something like Salesforce, I can pull in Salesforce data into Sentinel. I'm not paying anything extra other than storage costs on Sentinel, but there's clearly costs associated with what you're doing related to your Salesforce that you have locally as well too. All of these make up the ecosystem of what you have to consider with Sentinel as a whole.
So if you're just going to send an alert to Teams, does that cost you, or is it just when you start like doing automation?
Technically speaking, if you're sending an alert to Teams, you still have to have a logic app that's going to run. So it is going to cost you, but you're talking pennies on the dollar at that point.
That's cool. Okay, I just want to. That's great.
No, that's fine. So going into the idea of automation, I wanted to talk about two things. One, when you go through and look at the power of what you can do, you can see some basic examples here, but let me talk about some of the stuff that we've seen and had other customers explore. So one example, we were working with a customer that was a university, and wonderful security staff that they were going through and doing, but they weren't the most numerous staff, right? It's a university. They don't have 9,000 people that are going through and supporting them. So they had a problem that they had when COVID first hit, they had switched over to being a shop that could be doing stuff remotely like everyone else in the world had done. So they had a pretty good templated setup that they did in Teams that deployed out a folder structure. And especially for some of their older professors that maybe were not the most technology inclined, what they typically did for them was go and use the OneDrive sync client to sync their Teams system down onto their computer. So the idea was, okay, professor, you have this area where you can put in the lecture slides for what you're doing for the day. There's also a place that students can turn in their work. And then when you go into grade the work, there's just a folder on your computer you can go and view. Well, as the semester went on, obviously the files and the information in that Teams would grow. And so more and more information would be synced down to the professors' laptops. Well, eventually you had some professors that decided this was too much information. They didn't want all that data syncing to their laptop anymore. And the natural response from these professors was to go in and delete that data off their computer. Now, I guarantee you there are a couple of IT admins that are currently listening to this call that are chuckling right now, because if you've ever had a user do this when you have a OneDrive sync client set up, if you don't go in and stop the OneDrive sync client, when you delete the data off of your computer, it deletes it in the cloud too. Because as far as the OneDrive sync client is concerned, it's still syncing, and you've now said to delete everything. So they kept having this problem where professors would basically nuke out their entire course load. They'd then go in and show up to class on like Tuesday, and nothing would be in Teams. And so they basically lose a day. They'd have to put in a request for what happened. They go in and realize, oh, stuff got deleted. Here's how we can go through and do it. Well, there was an Office 365 security alert that was typically generated when this happened, which by extension means there could be a Microsoft Sentinel security alert that happened. So what we actually built out and what the university ended up doing was they put together a logic app that said, okay, when a Microsoft Sentinel alert is triggered, go in and see what that alert is. If that alert is a mass deletion event, I want you to go in and pull who is the user who called the mass deletion event and who is the user who owns the data. then shoot an email to those people. If it's the same person, you only have to do it once, but identify those people and shoot an email and say, hey, you just caused a mass deletion event and deleted all of these files. If that was intentional, you're fine. If you didn't mean to delete all the files, here's a list of instructions for how you can go through and restore them. And the idea was if professors did this unintentionally, they would basically get an automated email response that gave them the steps they needed to remediate this. And more than anything, meant that they didn't have just a completely dead class day where nothing got done. Perfect example of how they saw a trend in what was going on and doing, had a security alert that could be triggered related to that, and built in an Azure Logic app with automation that allowed them to address that. Now, their team of security people was still only like 3 guys, but instantly that gave them a response that could happen 24/7, 365 to an event that they saw happen somewhat frequently on their side. Now, we did several of these with them, but that was a perfect example of one of the things they went through and did with automation.
And so is that kind of some of the stuff you do in your managed services offering for the, or is that beyond the scope of that
Yeah, but
service?
potentially it kind of depends on where they want to go. If I want to be
Yeah.
honest about it, typically when we're going to architecting logic apps, that's probably we're going to lean on one of our
Yeah, it gets a
actual,
little bit.
Azure, one of our logic apps or one of our Power Automate guys. But that
Yeah.
is fair game to pull in and work with our team and stuff on as well too.
Absolutely, yeah.
The
Okay, very
last
good.
thing I wanted to mention, just because we're almost running out of time, is this section in here, which is under the community. There's actually a wonderful online community. I mentioned this at the start around Sentinel that definitely, if you're starting to go through and get your toes wet and explore what's going on, I want you guys to be aware. So to reiterate where I hit community, then I went to the onboard community content. And this is actually a GitHub repository. Obviously, Microsoft owns GitHub now, of a whole bunch of community generated and put together information. So you'll see everything from queries that you can go in and pull. So like just go in and pull actual queries you can do, to actual workbooks and playbooks that people have made. So the idea around workbooks is someone has gone in and put together their own visualization by manipulating the data and going through and pull. You can see if you're using Jupyter, a ton of stuff has been done in Jupyter to go through and do it. I really like looking through the playbooks. I got some of the playbooks I've deployed in my lab from here. But again, just going through and looking, these are automations that people have built to work with their system. And they said, hey, I could see other users wanting to do this, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can go out there and find stuff that people have already created that can potentially do what you're wanting to do. So again, the idea of like, oh, I'm going to go ahead and I need integrations with CrowdStrike, or I want to go in and I want to create an incident report about what's going on, or I want to create a Zendesk ticket. All of this has already been figured out and created and automated by someone else. All you have to do is go in and download the information and plug in your own logins into the actual login information to get it to work. So wonderful that this is here. It's really, really cool to see how active the community is. You can see there's stuff from even in the last couple days. This is something that people ultimately still work on and still contribute. And there's just so much information in here that's really cool. Really cool. The idea of some of the hunting queries you can go through and do to get an understanding of what you can dig into. And again, hey, you're using AWS. Here's stuff people have built together that are specific queries that could help you find what's going on in AWS.
Excellent. Since we're running out of time, so let's move on back to the slideshow. You ready?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
So this is really kind of what I wanted to get towards a point of ending with, and it's the idea that you can really pull in almost anything into Sentinel. So I kind of focus the presentation today on free services that I'm doing in my lab because that's easy to visualize and that's an entry point for everyone. I can pull in 365, I can pull Azure AD sign-in logs. There's wonderful stuff you can do around like Defender for Endpoint and Defender for Cloud and some of the things you can do around that. But there are so many connectors, and you can even pull in, like I said, other cloud or SaaS applications as well as on-premise reports. You can pull in Linux, you can pull in Windows servers, you can go in and ingest all of that and have this single pane of glass inside of Sentinel. Now, again, if I start to pull in server information from my on-premise, you are going to have cost of storing that data, but the idea of getting this single pane of glass that you can look into to get an understanding of what's covering your system is really, really powerful.
That's huge. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, definitely multi-cloud, multi-location, single pane of glass. That's awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I'm,
So
I'm gonna end. I'm gonna end on one more thing before we get to this. Before as a final slide, because I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this with everyone else. I want to talk about probably my biggest problem with Sentinel. Now, let me say first and foremost, Sentinel is probably my favorite product that Microsoft has come out with in the last 3 years. I think everyone from a security standpoint should be exploring it. I think the scalability with automation and machine learning that it gives you is the perfect example of the cloud at its best. It's taking the power that having segregated and cloud-based computing can really give you, and bring that to companies that maybe didn't have the resources to do that in the past on their own. But my biggest complaint with Sentinel, and it makes sense that it's designed this way, Sentinel is a one-way communication. You can go in and you can set up the connectors to pull all that information into Sentinel, but Sentinel doesn't push any of those updates back out. So really, the companies that are using Sentinel and using it great love it, love everything that's going about it, but you really have to be all in on Sentinel. It's kind of hard if you're using another service already and you're wanting to see what Sentinel can do and going and getting your feet wet, because say an Office 365 security alert is generated, which also generates a Sentinel alert. Well, I'm deciding I want to go through and work in Sentinel, so I go in and work that Sentinel alert and resolve it and think I'm good. That security alert is still sitting there in the Office 365 security alerts, because me resolving it in Sentinel does not resolve it on the 365 side. Now, extrapolate that out to every data connector that you have going in and pulling into Sentinel. So the fact that it's a single pane of glass is wonderful. It ties those events together. It really gives you a lot of power. But if you're just wanting to, put your toes in the water and see how it is as you're making a decision, for a short period of time there, at least, you're probably doubling your work, because you want to go in and see what Sentinel can do, see what the automations could do and the scalability there. But until you fully bought in and that's now your SIEM and SOAR and that's fully what you're doing for security, you're still going to have to be working with the other tools and using the other systems you have in place. And I wish that that was a better story than it is right now. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that. That's my one thing that I don't really like about it. And then the other thing I'll say is, billing can get a little confusing the more and more services you add into it. It's not that uncommon when I'm working with customers who have done this, that the first 6 months is, okay, we got a bill, let's go through and make sure we understand where these charges came from, stuff like that. Now, it can be understood, but the more services you put in, the more convoluted it gets. So wanted to mention those two things in the interest of being fair to everyone, but that's my thought. So this is where we're ending with useful resources. Ken can talk about this a little bit as well too, but if you don't have it right now, you can go in and look at what you can do inside of Sentinel and how you can deploy it. Microsoft has a wonderful aka.ms Azure Sentinel link that you can go through and do, and there's some good links to other blogs and stuff that talk about Sentinel and how you can actually go in and use it.
All right, so I'm going to ask the question, and maybe this is a stupid question, but so you say it's only one way, but if you go all in and you do like endpoint detection and response and alert, and you use those playbooks with SOAR, isn't that closing the gap and remediating that issue and resolving that alert in the Defender for Endpoint systems and the Azure Security
So you
Center?
could probably build into Azure Logic Apps to potentially do something like that, but natively, normally when you're going through and looking at the Azure Logic Apps, you're automating actions in response to what happened, not necessarily alert remediation in the other places. So I imagine if you really got into it, you could probably build that into your Logic Apps. But most of the time, I've seen Logic Apps do stuff like what I talked about with the university that we partnered with. There wasn't a part of that Logic App that then went through and closed the Office 365 security alert. They still had to do that process manually, even though they took care of the actions that were necessitated by that security alert firing in the first place.
So it sounds like in the future there may be some more automation, hopefully.
Yeah,
Maybe
no, for sure. And I expect this to continue to grow. Like I said, the coolest thing about this, as Microsoft gets more customers using Sentinel, everyone who's using Sentinel gets better, which is just a really cool concept and shows the scalability of the cloud.
So if you aren't using Sentinel yet, you might as well use it for the free stuff that we talked about today. If you're confused about that, give us a call. We're happy to walk you through that again. On this, so they can set up their own test lab, right? Using
but by all means, you can go in and start a trial and go in and pull this data. It's really, really easy to do. If you guys already have an Office 365 subscription, but maybe aren't doing stuff in Azure, you can go in and set a pay-as-you-go model on what you're going through and doing. And again, if you're keeping your focus to Office 365 to Azure AD, you won't see any charges through that.
Right. And I just added that one link here for Azure Arc and Security Center that Jason Griffith did a few months back, just because, again, if you have servers over in AWS, you could get those logs and put them in here. And that's kind of what Azure Arc's all about, is Defender for Server capabilities with multiple clouds and stuff like that. So it really all ties together, and it's really cool. These 3 links right here are great, though. They were in the newsletter. I definitely if you're looking for best practices, getting started information, I think those are great to look at and move forward with. We had a question about cost, and we also have a couple other questions here.
Yep.
So this is something I just found here to answer the questions for free data services. This is right off of Microsoft's website. So these are the data types that are for free. And this presentation could be available afterwards for you. On the cost side, the Azure Cost Management and Billing Hub provides useful functionality. So after you open like the cost management and billing location in the Azure portal, you can go to cost management and then do filters onto the service name to Sentinel and Log Analytics and Azure Monitor, and you can kind of see, what your costs are there. So it shouldn't be a surprise if you know what to do and know where to look, right?
Yeah,
And then,
and to kind of address Lance's question directly, I kind of agree with the idea of you already own it, but there is some usage cost here. What you're seeing on the screen that Ken has pulled together, if you're going in and setting up these connectors and ingesting, you will not see a cost related to doing this. You'll only see costs for these services if you increase the amount of time that you're choosing to store on the back end of Sentinel. Or like I said, if you get to the point that you're really doing automation, there may be small costs related to the automation that you're doing. But what you're seeing on the screen is what you go in and do for free. And like I said, I've had this running in my lab since Sentinel was in public preview before it actually even went live, and I've never gotten a cost for it.
Yeah, and then one last thing, you mentioned the community resources, right? So GitHub actually has a send-ingestion cost alert, so you can actually put some alerts on there. I found that right before the show.
To let you know, yeah.
Yeah, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, the other two questions too, we can go ahead and address those real quick.
Sure.
Tom said, were those estimates for ingested and storage prices per month? Yeah, they are. If you go into the Azure calculator, they'll literally say how much data do you think you're pulling in per month, how much storage do you think you're doing, how many queries do you think you're doing. That's where the costs are related to doing it. It is a per month cost that you're going through and looking at. And again, keep in mind, that's only going to be if you start pulling in on-prem resources, you start pulling in other cloud resources, stuff like that, or you're increasing that long-term storage cost. And then the second one was from Brett. He said, we're using SecureWorks for a monitor. Do we work in two systems as well? Are you aware of one that will close out the Defender incidents? Not off the top of my head, but I think Ken was probably onto something. I'm sure if you had someone who knew what they was doing with Azure Logic Apps, you could easily build something like that into response. You can 1,000% do Graph API calls off of what you're going and doing with Azure Logic Apps. And I'm sure you can use Graph API calls to close out incidents and to resolve alerts and stuff like that. So I'm sure you can build out the automation. If you are doing something in Sentinel, you know what you're doing on the Logic App side with Graph to go through and do that. And it wouldn't shock me if they natively bring that functionality. I really like what they're doing with Sentinel. It reminds me a lot of where Intune was like 8 years ago. Intune was what Microsoft designed as their own device management platform.
Yeah.
And even a couple years in, you started to see them come out with functionality. Oh, no, you're fine. Managed security service. Thanks, Brett. The idea of going through and looking at what all is involved. Intune started being able to do stuff 3 or 4 years into its development that no other platform that managed devices could do. And that's grown and increased when you're looking at what it does today. Sentinel's right at that point. I very much expect them to start bringing in leveraging functionality, especially on the integration of some of the Microsoft products that other SIEMs and storage just don't have the functionality to compete with because it's Microsoft coding to Microsoft, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and definitely check out the the GitHub community because a lot of that stuff may already be done.
For sure.
Yeah. So the last question was, YouAlreadyOwnIt appears to be usage-based. Well, again, there is some stuff you can do for free.
Yeah. We kind of addressed it at the start with your slide that you had for there. It's one of those things. I don't think going through and looking at all the functionality, even though there are some stuff that is paid from here, it doesn't by any means take away the value that you can get from the free side of Sentinel as well too.
Absolutely. All right, let's wrap things up. We got about 4 minutes here. We're happy to answer any questions as best we can about this legacy authentication update coming on October 1st. If you are an organization still using MAPI, RPC, offline address book, Exchange Web Service, EWS, POP, IMAP, Exchange, ActiveSync. That's the one that scares me the most. I think there's still some people using ActiveSync out there.
Yeah, if you have an old mail app set up on your iPhone or Android, you might be hit.
Yeah. Well, Microsoft's turning all this stuff up on October 1st, and they say that they're going to just randomly start turning off tenants on October 1st. Now, they do say that there'll be some kind of self-service diagnostic tool that will be available that you'll turn each one of these protocols back on if you need to. Yeah. Oh, you can do it today?
Yeah, you can do it today. So I kind of feel like I've been like the town crier for the last month, going with all of my customers being like October 1st is coming, legacy authentication.
That's right. We can't over communicate enough.
But yeah, basically, if you haven't heard of this before, this is news to you. Come October 1st, Microsoft is deprecating what they refer to as legacy authentication. SMTP auth won't be affected by this, which is by far the most common used one. But EWS and ActiveSync and some other services will be. There's different ways you can go through and address what you're using today. There's a wonderful workbook out there that's for free that you can go through and deploy again as long as you have an Azure workspace. But already today you can go in, they have instructions we can provide you from Microsoft where you can go in and actually request extensions to the first of the year. Now, Microsoft pushed this date back about 4 times. It doesn't appear like they're doing that anymore. So you can request the extension into the first if you still have stuff you need to go through and do. But be aware this is coming. Check if you have any service accounts or business systems that are still using legacy auth, and try to take steps now. You really have this week and next to go through and address that you don't have an implication or an impact. And if you need help understanding this, you just want to make sure you have the information, reach out to us. We've done a lot of this. We'd be more than happy to talk with you guys about it.
Thanks, Adam. Wrapping up, if there's any questions, feel free to come off mute or go ahead and put them in the in the chat window. If you we hope you learned something today. It seems like everybody has pretty much said they did, and then that some people may want some more information, so that's great. We hope this wasn't too confusing. We know that the angle was going to be, what can I do for free just to get my feet wet and get started? So hopefully we gave you enough information to get started on this. And I think we're going
to hopefully I didn't talk too quick.
Yeah, so we're thinking about the next topic being something about Microsoft information protection. It's going to be October 27th. It's always the 4th Thursday of the month. So if you have a topic that you want to hear about, please shoot us an email at youalreadyownit@go-planet.com, or contact me directly or your account team, and we'll see if we can get your topic into the lineup of future cloud office hours. So we're happy to do that. Also, just remind everybody, we mentioned this at the beginning of the program, we always do an Ignite recap for Office 365 and Power Platform. And since there's so many announcements, we always break it up into 2 different programs. Hopefully Adam will be back. Hopefully Jimmy Briggs will be back, and others, Jason Griffith and others. And then we'll do an Ignite recap part 2 on Azure and big data. I'm sure we'll get Miguel back here, and that'll be a lot of fun. We'll probably, I think November falls on Thanksgiving, so we're going to have to figure out the dates there. We haven't picked a date exactly yet, but it will be 2 dates. We will split it up into 2 different episodes.
You already own it. Bring your own turkey.
Yeah. Any guidance on your blog on how to build out a cheap free lab space?
Yeah, I'll write up something for that if there is some interest in that. We can add it as like a part 2 of the blog or something like that. I can write up a little response about how to approach it. The key thing there is, well, if you're ingesting Office 365 and Azure data, it needs to be coming from a system that actually has that data in it. So what I'll probably do is I'll probably talk about how you can set up Sentinel without ingesting cost in your environment today, with the idea that if you choose to grow it out later, because really, even if that's going to be the best thing to do, even if you're not doing a ton with it, because you'll still have the actual active data from your Azure AD and your 365. So you'll have information in there that you can mess around with.
Again, feel free to ask any more questions even after the program. This, you can always ask questions even after the session comes down. But we want to thank you for joining us on this September's You Already Own It Cloud Office Hours. We're always here to help, so reach out to us and we'll get you the answers you're looking for. Thanks, and we'll see you next month. Thanks, Adam. I appreciate your time. And thank you for all the folks that asked questions either before the show or during the show. We really appreciate that and helps us, really give you what you're looking for here. So thank you, and we'll see you next month.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ken. It's always great to be here.
Absolutely.